This webinar brings together expert panelists for a conversation with leaders from governors' offices to discuss the important topic of data ethics and equity. We hope you enjoy the discussion, which starts with an introduction by Martin Simon of the National Governors Association.
First panel is going to be focusing on sharing and using data effectively, ethically, and equitably. We designed this panel based on your feedback from previous sessions, namely that while state government wants to make better use of existing data, it's also important to navigate the ethical and equitable components of data use and sharing. Now, we have a great panel of the country's foremost experts on these topics, and they'll address some of the questions and concerns that we all have around the use of data. Beyond the panel discussion, there'll be an opportunity for question and answers, and then we'll have some coaching sessions with the panelists at the end of the meeting so that you can dive deeper into any of the other questions that you have that are particularly important to the work in your state. As Tim and Jed alluded to earlier, it's clear that if states are serious about equity, then leveraging data responsibly can really unlock the power that can lift up communities that are underserved or vulnerable so that no one's left behind. This is especially important in today's coronavirus pandemic crisis that we're in. You know, we know that governors play a key role in ensuring that state data initiatives have a role in driving decision-making and ensuring that data measurement, the data sharing, as well as data analysis is done with an eye towards equity. I think now more than ever, we need to have an eye towards the effective, ethical, and equitable data standards to ensure that state governments are truly serving everyone. And so with that as some context, I'll introduce the panel. Starting with the moderator, Chris Kingsley, who's a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. As Tim said, we appreciate the support. If you're hearing bells in the background, I'm in my den where I have a lot of clocks and I never know when they're going off. So just think of it as part of the atmosphere. We have an experts panel. Let me introduce them, starting with Della Jenkins, who's the executive director of the Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. Richard Gold, who's the former deputy secretary with the Pennsylvania Department of Public Welfare, the Office of Children, Youth, and Families. And Tyler Kleykamp, who's the director of the State Chief Data Officers Network at the Beek Center for Innovation at Georgetown University. So before I turn it over to the panel, just a reminder to please remain on mute unless you're going to ask a question. You can also use the chat function to ask questions. We'll have time for question and answers for the panel after they've made their remarks. So with that, I turn it over to you, Chris.
Great. Thanks very much, Martin. Really appreciate the work that you and your team at Results for America is doing. Thanks to NGA for hosting the boot camp. Congratulations, Tim, on the new position. And I hope everybody on this call is holding up okay. I know a lot of you are kind of the tip of the spear in the response to the virus. So as Martin mentioned, I'm at the Casey Foundation. I oversee our Strengthening Public Data portfolio here. Those of you who know Casey know we're not really a data and technology foundation. We're a foundation for kids and families. But one of the things that I've always really appreciated about Casey is it is an organization that believes deeply that better data and evidence are how we're going to do better by kids and families. I think all the way going back to our UPS roots when Jim Casey endowed us. He was the founder of UPS. And you'll see that in states probably showing up in terms of advocacy networks that we fund, like Kids Count, the work we do for the Fair Count of the Census in 2020. Hope everybody's filled theirs out. And we also really try and support networks who lead this work with and in partnership with government. So that includes panelists on the call today, like Tyler at the State CDO Network at BEC and Della at AISP. And Casey comes to this topic with a perspective based on our observation that most of the larger problems facing government are problems of coordination. And Tim, you mentioned that's certainly the case for the emergency response to COVID. It's also, from a kind of more Casey perspective, how we think about child abuse, neglect, and public safety. I mean, those are issues that are of immediate concern to schools and child welfare and juvenile justice and police. but they also really bear on decisions that we make about housing and workforce investments and mental health, the kinds of basic needs that unstable families have. And what we see again and again, right, is that when agencies have their own lists of clients and their own strategies and performance metrics, a lot of kids and families sort of fall into the cracks between those agencies. So states, all of you on this call, have a vast amount of data that governors can bring to bear on these issues. A lot of the work that Della has sort of, and her team have taught Casey about is how much that information is locked up in agencies, databases typically, and one of the first things you want to do towards coordination is find a way that you can share it in common. And that is probably an obvious point. It's maybe in the category of things that are obvious, but not easy to do. What's been amazing to watch from my vantage here is that just in the last several years, so many more states actually are creating that infrastructure to share information. There's been nearly a doubling of states with what we think of as integrated data systems at Casey, and I don't think that's primarily had a lot to do with technology or even with funding, which may be good news given the funding environment a lot of us are likely looking at over the next couple of years here. It's really been about leadership and governance and trust. It's that governors have said in many cases, we're going to use the data that we collect as a strategic asset. There are ways to share what our state superintendents and our health and human services commissioners know. We can do that safely and legally. And we're not going to use that information to embarrass or punish anybody. We want to use to ask better questions and make better decisions. So we clearly owe a thank you and congratulations to those of you, including a lot of you on the call here who've been involved in that good work. I did, though, want to issue a caution, which gets to the topic of today's conversation, which is I think that over the long term, this work only survives when there's fairly broad public buy-in. And the bad news is that almost nobody, when you think about a general public audience or your aunt or grandmother, really understands how much information agencies collect on them right now or how it's used. And we know from some messaging and ethnographic work that Casey and some of our peers funded that the first reaction people have when you tell them about it is some version of usually, yikes, stop it. And that has real consequences. I was doing ed policy work in 2013 and 2016. Some of you may have been around and remember the fight about student data privacy, which led to a huge opt-out movement among parents and also more than 300 legislative proposals introduced in state houses across the country. Superintendents lost their jobs. There's some question, right, about how much of that kind of brush fire around data privacy and data collection is possible outside of education. I think it is possible. And one thing I would note towards that is the civil rights community and their kind of advocacy organizations were huge defenders of states' rights and need to collect this information in the educational domain because they saw it as a key part of No Child Left Behind and knowing what was happening with Black and brown and poor students in the country. They have been taking a much more kind of adversarial approach to some of these new uses of multi-agency data out of fear, right, that they're potentially going to be used to discriminate and disadvantage poor and minority citizens. So the question for today's panelists in a broad sense is, I think, what can or what must states do to maintain what you could think of as like social license, the public's permission to continue to collect and share all of this stuff to try to solve hard problems. Because I would argue that we either figure this out on the front end or we're likely to pay for it in different ways on the back end when something goes wrong and advocates and legislators get involved. So that's the pragmatic reason, I think, for thinking about sort of ethics and equity now. The other reason, which I suspect is what brings many of you to the call too, to talk about this, is that I think we just genuinely want to do a better and fairer job for people. We've had computers, for 50 some odd years. They keep getting faster. We keep feeding them more information. In that time, the achievement gaps between Black and white Americans hasn't really budged. I think probably the gap between rich and poor Americans has probably moved a bit in the wrong direction. So in my view, it's a fair question to ask if states want to share information across government, across the enterprise to solve these big problems. Whose problems are we prioritizing? If we're going to spend a lot of foundation and taxpayer money building new data infrastructure, it has to be because we want to do these things better. So with that framing, my hope for the conversation today and the time we have is that we can offer some practical examples and some tools for navigating this terrain in state government. And we have just an all-star group to help. So we'll keep it conversational, but Tyler, I wanted to start with you. And before getting into a conversation about what states maybe could or should do, I think it'd be helpful to hear just about what they are doing. So if you could tell us a bit about the new state CDO network at Beck and how you've seen states think about ethics and equity as they're putting agency data to work, that would be terrific.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so as of today, there are about 25 states that have a chief data officer or comparable position. Colorado was actually the first state to create it in 2010, I believe. And really the idea behind our work is that this is a role that's evolved over time. It's not entirely well defined. And so our idea is to really bring all of these practitioners together, understand, one, what are sort of the core foundational elements that they are or should be working on, really with an eye towards how do they support their states in better leveraging data that they're already collecting. And then how can they sort of work collectively to either share information or address some of the common challenges that states are facing, whether it's sharing data, integrating data, governing data, managing it, using it, all the different things. And so, you know, we are really focused on not inventing new things for states to do, but really figuring out, okay, what's worked over here, and how do we help another 4 or 5 states implement something that's been successful in one place.
Do you want to say a quick word, Tyler, about any specific examples from states, or
sure,
we can come back to you and hear a bit from Della about their work as well?
I'll just give sort of a quick thing. One of the best things I heard, so I can't take credit for this quote, but another state chief data officer said, everything starts with shared objectives, and that all partners at the table need to buy into whatever it is that a state wants to do, or a group of agencies want to do around data, and that sometimes it doesn't always have to be super complicated. So as an example, Maryland, actually, there's someone from Maryland on the call. They were really looking to improve foster care placements for children. And really all they had to do was pull together some public data, like the locations of schools, hospitals, other, you know, sort of medical treatment facilities, different things where they could better identify more appropriate placement for a child based on their individual needs, so that those caseworkers could have a better feel of what was going on in an area when they were trying to place a foster child.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I pulled out of your work as relates to this conversation is there's so much fear in conversations that I sometimes participate in with advocates about potential misuse of government data. And those are real, and there have been examples that you know, we wish hadn't happened or should have been kind of foreseen. But it's also the case that I think so many of your agencies and so much of government is chiefly sort of intervening on behalf of some of the most vulnerable families. So, you know, to the degree that you can be more effective by better using data to think about how you're allocating resources and actually where in which communities you need to be most supportive. There's, I think, a strong argument for doing that, right? In terms of just the fundamental mission of government and what it's trying to achieve for people. But Della, let me turn to you. I mentioned that there has been a really striking uptick in the number of states that are doing this kind of work, and AISB has had something to do with that through the technical assistance and some of the work that you do. So you guys work across the country with counties, but a lot of states these days to help them build this infrastructure. I wonder what you would say about how you counsel states to think about data ethics and equity. And is there any practical guidance for leaders that may be up to their elbows in sort of building the infrastructure and are beginning to realize that this conversation is one that needs to be on their radars?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so we're in an interesting role at AISP because we're located at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia, but we work nationally, and we work primarily not with academics, but with government agencies and sometimes their research partners in academia around building capacity to do data sharing and linkage and to use data in practice. So the advice that we give is broad ranging. We do, you know, work on governance and legal and technical and, you know, capacity challenges that states are coming up against. But we often start the conversation thinking about something that Tyler already mentioned, which is the shared objectives portion. It's the why, it's the purpose for the data sharing. And so one of the things that we talk a lot with states about is thinking upfront about a framework for considering the risk versus benefit of a particular use of data. And so I think that's really important, first of all, to acknowledge up front that, that there is a risk to not sharing data. There's a risk to kind of business as usual when governments aren't able to make connections across silos. And we've gestured at that already a lot on this call, that we miss the opportunity to intervene and to support some of our most vulnerable citizens and communities. But there's also a real risk in terms of misuse of data or potentially inequitable outcomes that come from biases in data or uses of data that could have harm for communities. And so having those conversations up front is really, really important. And we think about mapping the risk and benefit of a data use on kind of a matrix. So you can think about, the x-axis as risk and the y-axis as benefit. And you can think about what are the things that are in that upper left-hand quadrant that are high benefit and lower risk. And we try to get people to start there. So, part of that is it's easier for the buy-in that Tyler spoke of, right? We want to find questions and policy priorities that are going to, that have kind of face validity for a lot of different agency actors and stakeholders, that would be a useful answer for us to have in government, and we could really make a change based on that. And we want to have as minimal as possible risk in terms of both privacy redisclosure issues, but also things like disparate impact in terms of how the information will be used ultimately. But the important thing too, I think there's like a risk benefit analysis that's really useful to be done as governor's offices with your agency partners and with other stakeholders, thinking about what's high benefit for those people involved. There's also the question that you mentioned, Chris, which is what is highest benefit and lowest risk for the people represented in the data? And that isn't always the same thing. So I think a really key part of the conversation is one, thinking about Tyler gestured at this, not getting fancy necessarily if you don't have to. What are kind of the descriptive questions you can answer with data that have really immediate impacts on how you would change resource allocation or the application of a program in practice? And how will that have practical effects that are positive for the people whose data you're using to do that? And the second layer of that is actually having community voice involved in prioritizing what those questions are. And obviously that's harder. And it's not something that as a state enterprise, you're going to be able to do every single day for every business analytic question you're asking using data. But I think it's something to really be working towards. And so we help states think about what that might look like. You can think of like a continuum of, informing people about uses of data all the way to actually having them empowered to be part of the decision-making about those uses of data. And I would say starting from, if you're not being transparent, if there's not kind of a structure in place for communicating clearly what's happening, that's the informing, and that's a really important place to start. But as much as you can be moving practice towards, are there different places in the use of data, in the planning of data infrastructure, in the execution of research, that you can actually be integrating people into decision-making about what happens next, how that data is used, what decisions are made based on that. That's a really good practice too.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to a couple of the points you raised, but let me get Richard in on this first. And Richard, for those of you who are less familiar with your work, Casey certainly has turned to you as one of like the legal experts on how to do this data sharing at the state level across the country. So thanks for your support on that, crafting enterprise MOUs or EMUs, as I think you labeled them. One response that I think a state, I've seen this, might have the challenges about the appropriateness of the kind of information sharing that they're doing and what they're doing with state data is to say, hey, this is all perfectly legal, safe, and secure. See right here, I have a document that outlines from our lawyers that we're permitted to do all of this. What's to worry? And I wonder when that is a fair and effective way to respond, and if not, what else do you think agencies should be doing and instructing their public information officers to be doing? Oh, Richard, do we have you?
Do you have me now?
Yes, we do.
Oh, there you go. Chris, thank you for your kind words. And I think I followed Della because she said if we could just not be fancy. I think she was referring to me. And so as an attorney for the last 42 years, the answer is, I'm thrilled that I'm not being asked, how do we get our lawyers to reach an agreement? And that we've moved past that the agreement is this magical document that's going to permit us to share data without problems. We're using people's data, and we need to include them and share with them what we're doing. Our public needs to know, you were kind enough to share a wonderful study by the Topus group, which really went through a process of figuring out how's the best way to talk to the community and get their views as to sharing data in an effective way. And they have some wonderful ideas of things to do. And on the other hand, they have some things to avoid, some of the pitfalls that I'm ashamed to say when I was reading some of the pitfalls, I've fallen into some of those holes.
Me too.
And luckily, it's always being able to climb your way out and correcting and then moving forward. You know, to hear or to read explaining to people how data can help us to help you, the client, as opposed to saying we need to share data to become more efficient and effective. I think we expect our government to be efficient and effective. And how are you going? Why do you need my private information to do that? Or how do we do our jobs better to improve the help we give you? And to tell them what data we're using, not in the way de-identified and using terms that we've all gotten used to, but really explaining how we're going to do it, showing them what we've done and the results of sharing that data. So they have a role at the beginning, the middle. I love Della's idea of actually having the community be part of the governance group. And also at the end, using your data, these are the changes we're going to make to help you. In 30 seconds, I am working on a project in a state that's creating an IDS for education, and I had the pleasure of meeting with a room full of parents of children being served by the public education. And the day we spent with them talking about how data can help us help their children, how working across systems and the data from other systems can help the education system help your children. And yes, there was mistrust. Yes, there was fear of a breach. And once those fears come out and are really expressed, what we're doing should be able to respond to those fears and have them help us move the project forward. So thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And very good comments. One thing I'll mention is our colleagues, at least some of them at Results for America, I know have seen that report from Topos that you referenced. And we can certainly share that around as long as, Jed, you and your team are comfortable doing that so folks can see. It comes with a toolkit which, you know, you can see what you think of it, but it does provide a kind of tested way of doing some of this messaging work. Let me pick up on that. I mean, one thing is, we've made a lot of mistakes at Casey, I think, in the way we just intuitively promoted this, including to policymakers and government partners. So it was, you know, it was a little mortifying, but healthy, I think, for us to actually get the research that pointed out that we might need to think differently about this. And for sure, like, every time we've caught ourselves using words like longitudinal, FERPA, or differential privacy, and polite company, it's like we've made a mistake. We're on the wrong path. You're pointing to the fact that there is a communications dimension to this, right? In addition to something structural about sort of how you do your business. And let me throw it out to either Tyler or Della. I'd love if you could build on that, because it strikes me that can be really difficult to do from within sort of state government, period, but also when you're having to sort of work out oftentimes through agencies, PIOs, and other stakeholders that aren't as kind of in the guts of actually doing this data sharing as you are. So I wonder how you think about your role as intermediaries there, and if you have any success stories or tools or examples you'd want other states to know about.
I'll try to take that. I think there's really two main sort of groups you're communicating with, and one is those internal state government partners or agencies that you're trying to work with, and then there are the public whose data you want to leverage for hopefully some type of public good. And I think the first part of that is that overall, nobody wants to see data being used to penalize somebody for something or for something punitive. So, and even those projects where, say it's like, you know, trying to uncover fraud, waste, or abuse. And so, you know, you think you've got data on people committing unemployment fraud or benefits fraud, and then you kick them off benefits. They're rarely successful, and they continue to create mistrust in government. And then I think internally within agencies, there's this fear that somehow data is going to make them look bad or something like that. And so I think that just continues to kind of tie back into this idea of shared objectives and understanding who are our partners here, including the people whose data it involves, and ensuring that the whole purpose is to improve services, outcomes, those types of things, and that they're articulated in ways that aren't threatening to people. And I'm certainly not a communications expert, which is why I think that Topos resource is so valuable. And the last part that I'd say is that data sharing is a two-way street. So if you're working with someone and their data is going into a black box and they have to do a bunch of work and they don't get anything back in return for that effort, you know, why would they participate in that, particularly when they're probably asking somebody else for data as well. So we kind of see that as a key role for chief data officers in particular, is sort of being that central person who can help facilitate some of those transactions amongst you know, individual agencies that might be going.
That's a great point, and worth lifting up is I think sometimes it's tempting when, Della, you framed it as like the risk-reward question, right? There's the sort of the scales of justice there. I think it's probably untrue in a lot of circumstances to say that there's no risk. But it is true to say almost all of us give a lot of our information over all the time, not just the government, but probably much more so to Google and Facebook and others, right? And we do that because there's a sense of we're getting something back for it in a pretty immediate way. And people can do their own calculus there. So Tyler, I think your point about demonstrating that value is important, because if the calculus they're doing is, well, I have no idea what's happening with this stuff, I don't see any value, any benefit, then almost no risk is worth it, right? But Della, let me turn to you for what I see as almost the toughest part of this, which is when I've been a part of conversations you've had about having the public be involved in a kind of more structural way, right? To have some voice in this, or their representatives have some voice in this. It has tended to be at the county level, where I think government feels a little bit closer to the people it's serving. And doing this at a state level is really difficult, right? And I wonder if you've given some thought, as much as AISP has sort of talked about governance and structuring these agreements and relationships, about at least directionally some good advice for states to think about how they could walk the walk, as well as communicating more clearly about what they're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I mean, it's undeniable that community engagement is easier at the local level. But I think that in terms of the ways that a state operates, there you know, I mentioned earlier, like, I don't think there's going to be kind of a one way that as an enterprise, the state sets a standard for how community is engaged in every decision. I think the key is to think holistically about decisions that are being made throughout the life cycle of both building and using data infrastructure and executing individual projects, and where are there places to slot in and authentically engage with community voice and community priorities there. So I'm thinking of examples that I've seen in practice, and generally they're not like this, you know, state X sits down and says, we're going to convene a bunch of people to talk about data. Like, I don't think that's going to be a very productive conversation. But generally it is using the agencies and offices and programs that are directly involved in collecting the data and implementing the services as messengers and conduits to having those conversations on individual projects. So an agency might do an engagement around a particular question to help have the community and kind of clients in those programs involved in thinking about what are the things we want to know more about how this program works or doesn't work, and what would be beneficial to you as a client to know. What are things that you as a client can tell us that maybe isn't reflected in your data or in our data, right? And so that, you know, I think it was Tyler used the word bidirectional, like, they're not only on the agency level, do the agencies have to be seeing bidirectional benefits to this, but I think community conversations about particular programs and the data that comes out of them and what's working and what isn't provide an opportunity for clients to say, yes, I understand that you want to use data to answer X question, but maybe also think about Y question that you haven't thought of. Or, yes, I understand that your data on my participation in this program tells you A, but also here's something that's not in your data about my life that maybe you need to also consider in crafting your research and evaluation question. And I've seen that done in multiple ways. I've seen it done in terms of like a data discovery workshop. I've seen it done as more of kind of a data gallery walk. I've seen it done through community participatory action research. And these are not, you know, these are not things we as government agencies are trained to do. So I think it's important to understand that there are resources out there and there are people who do these things who you can connect with and leverage their expertise, because it's not, I don't think it's easy for an agency or a governor's office to just say, oh, we'll come up with a engagement that's going to be productive and authentic. And but there are people out there doing this that can help with that. We have some tools, some meeting agendas for public stakeholder engagement. And we're working right now on a toolkit around particularly centering questions of racial equity and community voice in conversations about civic data infrastructure. And so that toolkit will have activities both that can be done interagency and can be done with community to think about some of these things.
Oh, that's great. I know that's in the works. Do you have a rough sense of when it'll be available, and is it okay if it gets circulated to this group if they'd like to see it?
Yeah, we would love it to be circulated to this group. It should be available in mid to late April. And it should be accompanied by a brief version. So this toolkit is quite long, and it's chock full of examples of work in action. So we really wanted to ground, you know, the theoretical conversation about equity and data in examples of how communities are doing this. So it's very long, but there will also be a brief accompanying it as more of a communications piece to help policymakers think about centering equity in data infrastructure.
Gotcha. So Richard, you got your mouth open like you're going to jump in. Let me hold it just 1 second. Are there any questions from the states on the line? I'll give folks 15 seconds to unmute themselves and jump in. You can also use your fingers if you want to use the chat function. Jed has generously given us a few extra minutes here if we want to use them. Okay, well, feel free to jump in at any point. And Richard, sorry, over to you.
That's okay. I just wanted to respond to something that Tyler said, which really rang a bell about the bidirectional. that it has to be mutual on both sides. That's also true when you're dealing with information coming from localities to the state. And it's something that, as a former state official, is very frustrating when I would get information from counties, and then when a report would come out, the county would say, "You must, that wasn't my information." It was very frustrating because I didn't know who else's information it was. But what I realized was there was no communication. The counties didn't feel that I was giving them any value. And so it wasn't bidirectional. And so those states that are building longitudinal systems and IDS systems, please think about how can we benefit the counties or the local school districts or the local schools in the collection of information we have. How can we give back to the counties or the locals so that they value the data they're giving to us?
That resonates with Casey. Tyler, I wonder if you wanted to jump in to defend the honor of states here.
Well,
No,
I'm from Connecticut, and we abolished counties in the 60s specifically so we wouldn't have to deal with it. But otherwise, no. I will say this as a state who frequently sent data to the federal government and it went into their black box. Similarly, dealing with local or other regional forms of government, I think that's a completely accurate characterization of the relationship to sort of the hierarchical nature of data and reporting structures that go on. It's one of the values of open data. So, you know, states collect lots of data. Maybe it can't, you know, in its sort of rawest form be made open, but versions of that can be. And and I would also just take it a step further to say that there should be a degree of openness in terms of the algorithms or the code or whatever's being used to integrate and analyze data within these systems so that one, people can understand you know, what's going on behind the curtain a little bit better in the event that there's concerns about whatever sort of data or analysis is released as a result of that. Those are critically important things as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll maybe conclude with one question that I didn't prepare any of you for, but might be relevant here, which is one of the ways that this conversation, I think, has gotten heated in some states in the last couple of years has been around algorithms, predictive analytics, automated decision-making, sort of different terminology gets used. And I wonder what you would say about either how to distinguish this kind of shared data work from that stuff when appropriate, to kind of hold the important work that states are doing harmless from some of the more controversial things, or whether you think that there's ways in which the folks that are building and operating these integrated data systems need to sort of address the question and pin their values to the mast and talk about their commitments when it comes to using algorithms and data science in these more sophisticated ways on public data.
It's a big question. I'll be really brief and then open it up to Richard or Tyler. I would just say that I think, yes, I think there should be a differentiation between data sharing and integration to understand complex social problems and support policy and program improvement, and predictive modeling and the use of algorithms in general. That doesn't mean that predictive algorithms and predictive models can't be useful in many contexts. But I think we have to be really careful that that use case in particular has levels of governance and oversight that ensure that both the piece you mentioned in terms of that people are able to see what's in the box and see how decisions are being made when they're automated, but also that there's a level of scrutiny in terms of the data that's being fed in, and that we're thinking really critically about the intersection between the actual data and the model, and then action and implementation based on what the algorithm is telling us. And I think that can be a hard communication. It sounds like it's kind of one thing, like the algorithm spit out this number and then this was the result. But really, it's a really complex process of interpreting what an algorithm is telling us, how much we trust it, what it's based on, and deciding how we use that information in practice. And that's a complicated question that I think we and you all as data stewards have to take really seriously if we're not going to muddy those waters.
Thank you. Richard, Tyler, either of you want to take a crack at that or just leave us with a few words of wisdom?
Well, I'll just
Go ahead.
Sorry,
Richard.
this is Alison Cordell, actually from Maryland, and I just had a couple things to say. I was just recently on a conference call discussing the Council on Open Data here in Maryland, and I'm vice chair of that council. I talked to them a little bit about what my vision is for the Governor's Office of Performance Improvement, as I've just recently stepped into this role back, I guess my first day was in like February 1st. And Maryland, you might know, is our #1 open data portal. It's America's #1 open data portal. So we have thousands of data sets that are on the open data portal. But what I think is really important, and things that you guys have touched on here, is, how do we welcome participants? How do we have, good, robust relationships with our partners? And then how do we keep the momentum going to provide up-to-date data? I talked to my team a little bit about, as what GoPi's vision is to help create understanding from those analytics that are provided, and how we can use the data to provide research and recommendations for process improvements. And the most important part I left them with was, how do we inspire? So how do we provide a forum for how researchers can utilize the data to inspire policy-based based work, research upon the quantitative and qualitative data that we're providing on the open data portal. So I am working on a website that can help pull all of these pieces together, but I'm loving what everyone's discussing. And so thank you so much again for the panelists on providing your expert advice.
Thank you. We'd love to see the website when it's ready, and thanks for your comment. Tyler, Richard, I'll give you the last words here. Maybe Tyler, starting with you, and then I have just a couple concluding comments, and we'll move on to the next thing here.
Sure. So I was just going to sort of finish off on the predictive analytics, AI, algorithm stuff, and simply say algorithms and computers should not be making decisions that affect people's lives. The quality and suitability of data that feeds those is fraught with bias and other issues. But those tools are useful to help point us into places to look for certain things, or to help sort of illuminate where something might be happening that requires further investigation.
Yep.
I'll just jump in. This is Joy from California. I think that's true to an extent, but the reality, this is a balancing process, and it's the level of human mediation of the decision should be tailored to the impact of the decision. And I worked with Harvard and Johns Hopkins in the past to put out a toolkit for going through a very conscious ethical weighing of those implications. And so like anything, it's not anything, but I would argue that it's more about a risk management process than ultimate answers that are black and white.
It'd be great if we could circulate that, Joy. Thank you for your comment. And for the benefit of folks on the call who might be thinking, it's tough to talk about algorithms or analytics in the abstract. I'm really having a question about this in child welfare right now in my state, or in juvenile justice or pretrial risk assessment. Casey does have both some expertise and some resources on those topics, so feel free to reach out and we can try to get you connected to people we think are thoughtful about it. Richard?
I'll go back to my original discussion about involving the public. If you're going to deal with data in a predictive analysis method, you must be prepared to spend the time and the effort to educate and hear from the public. It must be an open process because the misinformation, and I hate to use this term, but the fake news that will be generated by the predictive analysis will be more troublesome if you have not prepared and done your homework. You cannot have an algorithm that is private and won't be shared to the public. So the industry that's creating the algorithms have to understand that if they're going to be selling that product to government, they cannot insist upon the algorithm being private. It must be shared with the public so that the public sees what the elements are and sees that it's one tool in dealing with a public servant's job. It's not instead of the public servant. And I think there's a lot of confusion and apprehension that this is really replacing human judgment and replacing training and experience that we value highly. So it needs to be separate from just data sharing, which has enough problems of its own.
Well said. So thank you, first of all, to our three panelists. We covered a lot of ground, all the way from the parts of data sharing, which I think are not particularly about technology, the law, or algorithms. They're really about trust and leadership and relationships, all the way to where we ended. In both cases, I would just lift up that there's a communications and a practice dimension to this work. Some of us feel pretty well versed in one and not in the other. I think both are really important, and there's some resources I think that can help us get further down the road in both. So I know that the Results for America team has been doing a great job of circulating those as we talked on the messaging, and probably do that afterwards by email. So thanks to the Results for America team and to NGA for having us. I know from experience as well, I wanted to say that Tyler, Richard, and Della are extremely generous with their time when you shoot them an email or give them a phone call. And I guess we're going to have some time this afternoon if you want to stick around to do some small working group sessions. But I really would encourage you, if any of this piqued an interest or raised something that you're wrestling with, to reach out to us, and we'll see what we can do to be of assistance. Let me hand it back.